Hello, good day. Sir Howard here as always. Welcome to another episode of Libreng Sit-In where currently ang pinag-uusapan natin is on the field of psychometrics. Last episode, kung napanood ninyo, I mentioned there, yun na yung last episode natin for talking about norms in psychometrics. Pero bago ko matulog kagabi, napag-isip-isip ko na meron pa akong isang topic about norms na hindi na-discuss na sa tingin ko all psychometricians and all aspiring psychometricians or even all psych majors must know. So I am going to break what I've said from the previous episode. Today, meron pa tayong isang episode here in Psychometrics about norms. So idudugtong natin yung discussion natin on the value of norms in the field of psychometrics. This is part 5. Today, we're going to talk about the basic principles of using test norms. Siguro naman at this point, alam na alam nyo na kung anong ibig sabihin ng norm at ano ang silbi ng norm. But just in case you forgot, we use test norms para magkaroon ng ibig sabihin o ng kahulugan or ng interpretation yung isang raw score. So you administer a test to a subject and then you check the test of that person. You get the raw score. Next step, you interpret that raw score using the norm para malaman mo kung anong ibig sabihin ng raw score. Is it average, high average, superior, low average, borderline, mildly impaired? And that is important. Dapat alam natin yung ibig sabihin ng raw score because that will help us determine kung ano yung dapat nating aksyon na gagawin given the meaning of that raw score. Bibigyan mo ba siya ng scholarship? Kailangan ba niya ng remedial? So on and so forth. Pero in this episode, ang gusto kong i-discuss sa inyo is hindi lang tayo gamit ng test norms. Every time we get a raw score and then we get the norm to interpret that raw score, meron ka munang mga principles na dapat tatandaan that applies to the norm before you use that to interpret the raw score that you have. Yan ngayon yung pag-uusapan natin and let's go straight directly to principle number 1. Alam nyo, bago kayo gumamit ng norm to interpret a raw score, always check the indicators of its appropriateness. Kapag nakahanap ka o nakakuha ka ng isang raw score, tapos i-interpret mo na yung raw score, nasa harap mo na yung norm na gagamitin mo to interpret the raw score, tatanungin mo muna yung sarili mo, tama ba o appropriate ba yung norm na ito given the characteristic of my raw score. Kumbaga, ang magandang analogy dito, parang body and blood yan eh. Parang katawan at dugo. Dapat match yung katawan doon sa dugo na isasalin mo. Yun din yung dapat natin gawin in the field of psychometrics before we interpret the meaning of a raw score using the norm. Tatanungin mo yung sarili mo, match ba yung katangian ng raw score sa katangian ng norm na gagamitin mo? Napakahalaga niyan. Let me repeat. Before you interpret a raw score using the norm, you need to make sure na tugma, match dapat yung qualities ng raw score that you have with the raw score of the norm na gagamitin mo pang-interpret nung raw score na yan. So the next question is, ano ba yung mga katangian or the qualities of the norm na dapat mong chine-check bago mo gamitin yan para i-interpret yung raw score mo? Number 1, match dapat yung nationality ng norm doon sa nationality ng raw score na i-interpret mo. Or to make the long story short, kailangan alamin mo yung origin nung norm bago mo siya gamitin to interpret your raw score. More or less, dapat pareho sila ng origin. The origin of the norm must be the same as the origin of the raw score. Halimbawa, yung raw score mo galing sa isang Pilipino. Obviously, dapat yung norm na gagamitin mo is a Filipino norm. If you have a raw score coming from an American, obvious ba, edi dapat yung norm na gagamitin mo is American norm. This is a very basic principle, napakadaling intindihin, pero obviously, in the field, in practice, marami ang nagvo-violate niyan. Okay? Kaya nga given this principle, you need to really develop norms that are local. Halimbawa, meron kang psychological test. I-administer mo yon sa mga, let's say, 8-year-olds na Pilipino. Dapat yung norm na gagamitin mo to interpret those scores coming from that test must also be a norm coming from Filipino population. Basta yun ang tatandaan nyo, no? Dapat match yung nationality nung norm doon sa nationality ng raw score na i-interpret nyo. That's why we really need local norms. But here's the problem. And this is a common practice in Philippine testing. Maraming mga pagkakataon where we don't have local norms. We don't have. Diba? Halimbawa, well, let's talk about ALSAT or the Otis Lennon School Ability Test. Personally, when I was a guidance counselor, ina-administer ko dati yan. Now, definitely ALSAT is not a local test. It's not. Apelyido pa lang Otis and Lennon. These are not Filipinos. Therefore, if you buy this test and then you check the manual of the test and you go to the page of the norm, it will tell you na ang norm doon, ang mga tao na bumubuo sa norm ng ALSAT are American population. Now, this becomes a problem if you administer ALSAT to a Filipino and then the raw score of that Filipino is compared to the American norm na ginagamit ng ALSAT. Diba? In fact, to be more specific, based on my experience, alam nyo ba yung ALSAT, when you administer that to a Filipino, yung raw score niyan, ikukumpara mo sa college students from a US university. And you have no choice. Bakit? Yun kasi yung nakalagay sa manual Yun lang talaga yung norm na available in the manual, so you will be forced to interpret the raw score using college students from a US university, which is, psychometrically speaking, it's not good. Ano ang posibleng problema kapag kinumpara mo yung isang raw score with a norm na hindi appropriate, hindi siya local norm? There might be inaccuracy. Ibig sabihin, kung ano man yung label na ibigay sa'yo nung norm, given the raw score of that person, we cannot be entirely sure. In fact, there is a high chance. Malaki ang posibilidad na yung label na makukuha mo to interpret that raw score, it's not accurate. Mali. Kaya mahalaga talaga na sisiguraduhin mo tugma ang raw score doon sa quality ng norm. Kaya alam nyo, given this problem, let me just use this video to present to you some of the responses na sa tingin ko kailangan natin gawin as psychometricians. Una, kinakailangan talaga natin na mag-adapt ng test. Ibig sabihin ng test adaptation is we are in the process of localizing a foreign test. Like halimbawa sa Pilipinas, marami tayong ginagamit ng mga foreign test. Hindi pwedeng gamit lang tayo ng gamit ng foreign test. We need to adapt those foreign tests and make it more locally appropriate. And what do you mean by locally appropriate? It means you are going to transform the test in a way or in a form where it becomes more appropriate with our local people. So, papilitan mo yung mga items dyan, i-retranslate mo yung items to our own language. Siguro, babawasan mo yung items or dadagdagan mo yung items. But most importantly, given our topic right now, ang pinaka-dapat nilolocalize natin is the norm. So, kung ang mga kumukuha ng test mo sa Pilipinas ay mga Pilipino, ang norm na dapat mong gagamitin ay pang-Pilipino rin. Binubuo rin dapat ng raw scores ng mga Pilipino. In fact, this action was demonstrated in the history of Stanford Binet. Yung Stanford Binet naman kasi, in history, no, yan ay isang French test. After all, si Alfred Binet, nag-imbento ng Binet test or the original 1905 scale was French. He came from France. So when he developed this test, he intended the test para sa mga Pranses. Inadapt lang naman ng United States yan eh. Because the test is so successful, the Americans wanted that test in their country. So, in-import nila yung test. Pero nung in-import nila yung test, ginamit ba agad nila? Hindi. Inadapt muna nila yung test to be more appropriate to their population. Kasi hindi naman sila mga French eh. Iba yung French, iba yung American. So, they wanted the test to be more Americanized. Pinalitan yung language, pinalitan yung mga items, most importantly, pinalitan yung norm. Sino ang gumawa ng lahat ng yan? Si, uh, sa dulo ng dila ko, sino nga ba gumawa nun? Gumawa niya si Louis Terman, who was then a teacher in Stanford University. Kaya siya tinawag na Stanford Binet. To give credit to the university where Louis Terman was working at nung inadapt niya yung original 1905 scale from French, ginawa niyang more Americanized. Ganon din dapat sa Philippine testing, no? Yung mga test na ginagamit natin na foreign, kailangan gagawin nating more Filipino. Kasi maraming mga items doon, because they are foreign tests, they are not even appropriate. They are not within the sphere of experience of Filipino test takers. Lalong-lalo na syempre, in connection to what we're discussing now, yung norm. Diba? Yung mga American norms na yan, coming from American test, those need to be changed and make it more localized. Make it Filipino norm. Another response na dapat nating ginagawa is local test development. Iba yun sa adaptation, no? Yung test adaptation kasi you are localizing a foreign test, pero yung test development, local test development, gagawa ka talaga ng isang local test na lalaban sa isang foreign test. Like for example, ginagawa na naman to, no, in the field of psychometrics, personality test. Ang problema sa personality testing in the Philippines, most personality tests that we use are foreign. Mga pangalan pa lang, di ba? Like, let's say, Myers-Briggs, type indicator. Si Myers at si Briggs, hindi naman mga Pilipino yan. Di ba? Pero ang problema dyan, meron tayong konsepto ng Filipino personality. Ibig sabihin, meron tayong unique features of personality that only exist within the Filipino culture. So nagkakaroon ngayon tayo ng problema if we use foreign tests that don't even acknowledge the existence of Filipino personality, tapos gagamitin mo yon sa ating local context to measure personality. But what can we do? Wala naman kasing available na local personality test. Kaya nga merong mga psychometricians, merong mga test experts in the Philippines, yan yung nagiging project nila in their careers to develop local test na pwede nating ipangtapat sa mga foreign personality test. Like for example, panukat ng ugali ng pagkatao. Gumagawa rin tayo ng mga iba't ibang mga personality test na may kinalaman sa introversion and extroversion but in the Philippine edition. Kasi they're saying na ang introversion and extroversion might be expressed differently sa Filipino culture. Kasi yung mga words na yan, introvert and extrovert, when you read things about introversion and extroversion, usually talaga, ang idea is foreign, American. American introversion, American extroversion. Pero dahil meron ngang Filipino personality, it's possible na yung introversion and extroversion is expressed differently in the Filipino culture. Kaya marami na namang gumagawa niyan. Mag-develop tayo ng personality test from scratch na pwede nating ipangtapat sa mga foreign personality test na madalas nating ginagamit. Another thing na dapat i-check mo sa norm mo kung match ba sa raw score is none other than age or edad. So halimbawa, simpleng example, yung raw score mo galing sa isang bata na edad 5 taon. Dahil dyan, dapat yung norm mo na gagamitin norm ng mga 5 years old. Again, kapag matigas ang ulo mo, 5-year-old norm o 5-year-old raw score yung nasa kamay mo, kinumpara mo yan sa isang 23-year-old norm, ang magiging epekto niyan, inaccurate assessment. pwedeng mali yung label na maibibigay mo sa norm o sa mabibigay mo sa raw score, I mean. Pag mali ang label na naibigay mo sa raw score, that will lead you to an inaccurate assessment, and inaccurate assessment can be dangerous. Kasi kapag mali yung assessment mo sa tao, mali din yung decision mo. Remember, your decision about a person, kung ano ang ire-recommend mo na gagawin niya o gagawin sa kanya, depende sa assessment. So if you have a wrong assessment because you have used a wrong norm, that leads you to a wrong decision towards the person na pwede pang ikasira ng kanyang buhay. Kaya para maiwasan yan, dapat imamatch mo yung edad ng raw score doon sa edad ng norm. Halimbawa, ang raw score mo, si Jenny, na nasa grade 6, 12 years old. Raw score is 12-year-old Jenny, grade 6. Now, raw score niya is 80 over 100. 80 over 100. How do you interpret this? Anong ibig sabihin ng 80 over 100? Then you use the norm. But look at this. What 80 over 100 means, mag-iiba-iba yan depende sa kung anong edad ng norm mo kinukumpara yung raw score na yan. So 80 over 100, if you compare it to 7-year-old norm, it means excellent. You compare it to 9-year-old norm, it means above average. You compare it to a 12-year-old norm, it means low average. And given this example, dapat mo talagang makita yung kahalagahan na tugma dapat yung raw score mo o yung norm na gagamitin mo doon sa raw score na i-interpret mo when it comes to age. Because the meaning of that raw score will differ. Depende kung anong norm, anong edad ng norm ang ginagamit mo. Kaya ang magandang application dito is, again, we need to construct developmental norms. Ibig sabihin, iba't iba ang norm mo depende sa edad. Halimbawa, may test ka. Dapat iba ang norm ng grade 1, iba ang norm ng grade 2, iba ang norm ng grade 3, so on and so forth. Ino-consider natin yung edad. Dapat yung norm o yung edad ng norm mo tugma doon sa edad ng raw score mo. Ang ALSAT ginagawa yan eh. Alam nyo ba yung ALSAT? Napakakapal ng norm nito. In fact, it's one entire booklet. And the reason is, bakit ang kapal ng booklet nito on their norms? Usually kasi ang isang standardized test, ang norm page niyan is hindi lalagpas ng 5 pages eh. Pero ang ALSAT isang buong booklet norm. Bakit? Because it contains a lot of norms. Why does it contain a lot of norms? Kasi yung norm niya, years and month specific. Ang tawag ng ALSAT dyan, meron silang developmental norms. Like for example, familiar ako dito kasi ginamit ko to nung naging counselor ako. No? Alam nyo ba sa ALSAT, meron silang norm, hiwa-hiwala yung norm nila, depende sa edad in years and month. Impressive. For example, iba yung norm nila for 7 years and 1 month. Iba na naman yung 7 years, 2 months. Iba na naman yung 7 years, 3 months. O, bilangin mo ilang norms meron ang ALSAT. Yung ALSAT pwedeng kunin yan ng 7 years old hanggang 25 years old. Tapos, bawat isa dyan, meron silang norm. 7-year 1 month, 7-year 2 months, hanggang sa 7-year 11 months, 8-year 1 month, 8-year 2 months, 8-year 3 months, hanggang makarating ka sa age 25. Ganon karami ang norm ng ALSAT. That's why, bigyan ko lang kayo ng trivia, no? When you administer a student ALSAT, one of the things that you really need to make sure na maisulat ng test taker is his or her age in years and in months. In years and in months. Maraming beses na akong napagalitan dyan, no? Minsan, ang nilalagay lang kasi yung years, eh. But look at this, given the norm of ALSAT, hindi mo siya mai-interpret kung hindi mo alam yung birthday niya in years and in months. Because that's how specific ALSAT is. Because the norm that it's using is per year of birth plus months. Ganun katindi ang ALSAT. And ALSAT is applying that principle of matching the raw score's age with the norm's age. Last one. Another thing na dapat pareho yung raw score mo and the norm is the biological sex. Actually, this is a very controversial issue in the field of psychometrics. Should we separate the norms between male and female? Kasi merong mga implications yan eh, di ba? Lalong-lalo na merong mga feminists na hindi comfortable in that idea. Na parang merong sex differences. Na parang hindi pantay, hindi co-equal yung babae at lalaki. But many authors in the field of psychometrics, they are highly recommending that there are times we need to separate the norms between males and females. So to answer this question, should we separate the norms between male and female? Well, depends. Depende. Depende saan. Yung psychological construct na minimeasure nung test mo, meron ba siyang sex difference? That's very important. Halimbawa, no? If you read this kind of books, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, very good book by the way, it tells you that there are certain psychological characteristics na iba talaga sa babae, iba sa lalaki. Meron tayong mga kaugalian, meron tayong mga psychological components na scientifically proven, they differ between males and females. So basically, this book is telling us that there are sex differences. Sex differences are real. And that idea must be applied in the field of psychometrics. In what way? Mayroong mga pagkakataon, given the construct of your test, given what your test is measuring, kailangan talaga separate yung norms mo for male and female. Like for example, ano ba yung mga psychological components that are known to really differ between males and females? Verbal ability, numerical ability, emotional sensitivity, and aggression. So kung yung test mo, yan yung minimeasure, yan yung test construct, kinakailangan talaga ibahin mo yung norm for males and females. Because literature established that these things differ between males and females. Pero hindi naman palagi. Meron kasing mga psychological constructs na wala namang kinalaman yung sex differences. Regardless if you're male or female, no differences in the following constructs like general IQ or self-esteem. In that case, kapag ito yung minimeasure ng test mo, general IQ or self-esteem, hindi mo na kinakailangan paghiwalayin pa yung norm ng lalaki sa norm ng babae. So, ang implication dito, i-check mo muna sa literature. Let's say you are developing a test. I-check mo muna in the literature if the construct of the test you are developing, meron nga bang sex differences. Okay, let's move on to principle number 2. The norm should be the representative of the target test takers. Let me repeat. The norm should be the representative of the target test takers. In fact, yung principle number 2, dapat alam ito ng mga test constructors, yung mga gumagawa ng test. Kasi yung implication ng principle number 2 has something to do with how should you select people who will be forming your test norms. Keyword representative. Ibig sabihin ng representative in the field of research, all sectors of the population or all types of people in that group form the norm. Lahat ng klase ng tao na konsidera doon sa norm na binuo. Halimbawa, para mas malinaw, merong isang survey na lumabas or nagtanong-tanong sa mga Pilipino, are Filipinos in favor of condom use? Sabihin natin na ang sinurvey dito, 3,000 Filipinos. And then, let's say, according to the results, 95% of those Filipinos, the 3,000 Filipinos, in favor of condom use. 95%. Question. Can we now confidently say na ang mga Pilipino pabor sa contraceptive use? Well, key question. Bago ka maniwala dyan, bago mo sabihin na ang mga Pilipino pabor sa contraceptive use, no? Sino muna yung mga sinurvey? That's the first question that you need to ask every time you hear survey reports. Who are the people surveyed in the study? For us to believe that Filipinos in general are in favor of contraceptive use, kailangan representative ng buong Pilipinas yung 3,000 Filipinos na sinurvey dito. And what does that mean? All areas in the Philippines, more or less, were considered in the survey. Ni-research mo yung survey, nalaman mo, ito ang representation ng survey. 90% of those 3,000 people came from Luzon, 10% from Visayas, and none from Mindanao. In this case, it's unfair to say that Filipinos in general are in favor of contraceptive use. Bakit? Hindi naman well represented yung Pilipinas in that survey. It's not representative of the Filipino people. I'm talking about the 3,000 kanina. The 3,000 people they asked did not represent the entire Filipino people in the Philippines. Kasi kulang sa Mindanao eh. Tapos 10% lang sa Visayas. Ang Pilipino, pag sinabi mong Pilipino, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao yan. Kahit saang lupalop ka ng Pilipinas naroon ang tawag sa'yo Pilipino. So ang Pilipino, regardless yan, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. Therefore, to make things more fair, para mas maniwala tayo sa survey, dapat yung 3,000 na yon represented all Filipinos in all areas of the Philippines. Kung ganito ang naging sistema, talagang per island in the Philippines, more or less merong representative na sumagot ng survey, then we can be more confident that indeed, Filipinos in general are in favor of contraceptive use. Kahit sa mga presidential surveys, madalas naglalabas ang mga survey companies niyan. The first question you need to ask before you believe that Filipinos want these people to be their next leaders, sino ang mga tinanong? Yung mga tinanong ba represents the entire Filipino population, and that means Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. Kapag nakita mo na ito ay NCR lang, o ito ay Visayas lang, o ito ay Mindanao lang, then you don't have the right to say that generally Filipinos like this candidate, does not like that candidate. Siguro i-specify mo kung sino yung mga tinanong mo dito. Halimbawa, ilabas mo yung survey na yan, but specify in the report that this survey was conducted among Filipinos in NCR. Yan, pwede yan. But for you to say na buong Pilipinas as if parang ang typical na Filipino gusto yung ganitong kandidato, tapos hindi naman represented, hindi naman well represented yung mga tinanong mo, that is unfair, that is simply inaccurate. Now, the same thing applies in psychological test norms. Gagamitin ngayon natin to in the field of psychometrics. Halimbawa, gumagawa ka ng test that is meant to measure, let's say, the intelligence of college students. So, gumawa ka ng mga items, reliable na, valid na, now you're developing the norm. Anong norm dapat yung anong norm dapat yung bubuuhin mo given the nature of your test. Dahil yung test mo, nagme-measure siya ng something, psychological component of college students, then the norm that you will be forming must well represent college students in the Philippines. Hindi ko pala nasabi dito, dapat Filipino college students. You made a test meant to be answered by Filipino college students. O, dapat yung norm na bubuuhin mo, well represented ang lahat ng klase ng Filipino college students. So that means, to make that happen, kailangan meron kang mga representative of college students from different schools. Schools from UAAP, schools from NCAA. Actually, kulang pa nga yan, no? If your test is really meant for college students in general, regardless kung Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, ay di dapat meron ka ring representative scores coming from schools sa Visayas, coming from schools in Mindanao. Pero kung ganito lang ang ginawa mo, karamihan kasi dyan, nasa NCR, di ba? O, so dapat sasabihin mo na yung norm na ito is the norm that I formed using NCR schools. Okay? So, halimbawa, may kumuha ng test. Galing siya sa Mindanao. So, yung raw score niya ay galing sa isang tao sa Mindanao. At yung school niya, hindi naman kasama doon sa norm na nabuo mo. Anong ibig sabihin nun? Then, you cannot interpret that raw score. Hindi mo pwedeng i-kumpara yung raw score ng taga Mindanao doon sa norm ng mga taga NCR. Okay? Another example, let's say, you are developing a test that measures stress among mall employees. So ano dapat yung gagawin mo sa norm mo? Sino dapat ang bubuo sa norm na binubuo mo? Dapat yung norm will represent more or less all mall employees in the Philippines. So dapat meron kang scores na galing sa mga empleyado ng SM, galing sa empleyado ng ROB, galing sa empleyado ng Isitan, at lahat ng mall sa Pilipinas. Wala pa dyan yung Fisher Mall, wala pa dyan yung Glorieta. O, di ba? O ngayon, kung yung test mo, talagang para lang sa NCR, yung norm na nabuo mo, puro NCR lang, you determine, you identify that in the manual, na itong norm na ito ay para lamang sa mga empleyado ng mall na nakatira sa NCR. Hindi mo pwedeng gamitin yung norm na yan to interpret a raw score na nanggaling sa empleyado ng mall na nasa Visayas o nasa Mindanao. Unless, i-expand mo yung norm mo. Mag-data collection ka sa Visayas, data collection ka sa Mindanao, i-integrate mo yan sa current norm mo, there you go. Now, basically, all people who will be taking that test, as long as small employee siya, pwede mo nang i-interpret using that norm. Now, many students ask me, why should we even do this? Kung titignan nyo kasi napaka matrabaho niyan. Ang dami mong dapat gawin. But let me explain to you the logic why we need to do this. You just remember the concept of standard deviation. Remember, yung standard deviation ng isang testing population, iba-iba yan, depende sa population. Standard deviation is the dispersion of scores, yung layo ng scores sa isa't isa. Gaano kalayo yung scores sa isa't isa, depende nga yan bawat norm. Pwedeng iba ang standard deviation ng population A, iba na naman sa population B, iba na naman sa population C. Because each of this population differ in their characteristics. And standard deviation, if you remember our discussion before, napakahalaga niyan because this will determine the meaning of the raw score. The standard deviation will affect kung saan babagsak yung raw score within the area of the normal curve. Diba? Yung laki ng bawat area ng normal curve that will give meaning to the score is highly dependent on the size of the standard deviation. Now, let's go back to our example. Halimbawa, nagde-develop tayo ng Filipino test. This test is meant for Filipinos. Okay? Ngayon, ito ang problema, no? Kapag yung gagamitin nating norm ay isa lang, we just use the Luzon norm, or we just use the Visayas norm, we just use the Mindanao norm. Remember, iba-iba ang standard deviations niyan. So if you want your test to be available, or if you want the test to be available for anyone who is Filipino, and you want to interpret the raw score of that person, ano ang solusyon? Ang solusyon dyan, i-combine mo. I-combine mo yung iba't ibang mga performances ng iba't ibang mga tao in the Philippines. In this case, i-combine mo yung general performance ng Luzon population sa Visayas population sa Mindanao population. And in connection to what we're talking about right now, how do you do that? Habang ginagawa mo yung norm, merong kang raw scores coming from Luzon, raw scores coming from Visayas, raw scores coming from Mindanao. I-combine mo lahat yon in a way, parang ang ginawa mo na rin dito, palakihin ko lang, kinumbine mo na rin yung standard deviation ng tatlong archipelagos na yan. Kinumbay mo na yung performances ng Luzon, sa Visayas, sa Mindanao. And yung mabubuo mong norm dyan, yan na ngayon yung pinaka-average normal performance of the Filipinos. And when that happens, kapag yung norm mo ay ganyan, then definitely all Filipinos can take your test and their raw score can be interpreted using that norm na kinonsider yung Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao population. Yan yung ngayon tinatawag nating Filipino norm. So sana naging maliwanag yung explanation ko, no? O, ngayon, anong mapapala natin sa representative norm? Again, why do we want our norm to be representative of those people who will be taking the test? Because again, we remember the word accuracy. Because the more the norm has representative or represents all types of people, of target test takers, mas makakaasa tayo na tama yung magiging label natin o yung interpretation natin ng raw score. And the reverse is true. Kapag yung norm mo hindi naman representative, pero ginagamit mo yung norm na yon for anyone who's taking that test, very high chance that the label that you are giving to the raw scores are inaccurate. Principle number 3, in using norms, you need to remember that norms should be constantly updated. Merong expiration date yung norm na meron ka. Hanggang 5 years lang yan. Kaya alam nyo, kung meron kayong isang existing standardized test using a norm, after you develop the norm, hindi pa tapos ang trabaho mo. Kasi yung norm na ginagamit mo hanggang 5 years lang. So what do you need to do? Within that 5 years na tumatakbo yung norm mo, as you administer the test to different people, kinokolekta mo yung mga raw scores ng mga taong yun within the 5 years that the old norm is still valid. And then anong gagawin mo doon sa mga data, doon sa mga raw scores na nakukuha mo? Later on, yun yung gagamitin mo to form a new norm. So by the time the 5th year is done, expired na yung norm mo. Yung mga kinokolekta mo within that 5 years, yun ngayon yung gagamitin mo to update. Yun yung term doon, to update the old norm. And kapag nabuo mo na yung updated norm, then that's the norm that you are now going to use for the next 5 years. The old norm, yung 5 years na nauna, wala na yun. Hindi mo na dapat gagamitin yun. Ang gagamitin mo is yung updated norm. Why do we need for update? This is a very important question. Why do we need to update our norm? Because when we talk about psychological components of people, personality, intelligence, introversion, extroversion, spirituality, religiosity, sexual promiscuity, lahat yan, they change as time goes by. Diba? Human beings are dynamic. Pinag-aaralan yan sa human development. So it's always possible that as time goes by, yung standard natin for a certain psychological component nag-iiba. Nag-iiba yung expression ng ganitong ugali, lalong-lalo na when we talk about intelligence. In fact, this is where I'm going to connect the Flynn effect. Flynn effect is a phenomenon in testing where, statistically speaking, we see people are getting smarter through time. Never pa in the history of man na yung IQ ng tao ay bumaba as time goes by. In other words, as years advance, yung intelligence, yung katalinuhan ng tao pataas ang pataas. And ibang lecture na naman yan kung bakit kaya, di ba? Pero may mga common suspects na dyan. Improvement in education, technological contributions, new teaching strategies, so on and so forth. But that's what you mean by Flynn effect. The standard of intelligence changes as time goes by. Now, given Flynn effect, if you can get the logic of Flynn effect, the more you understand why we need to change our norms, why we need to update the norm. Let me give you a concrete example. how Flynn effect will force us to update our norm. Halimbawa, meron tayong dalawang norms dito from 1985 and 2013. Now, you reflect. The ceiling of 1985 norm is 60 to 65. So, if you get a raw score of 60 to 65, ang tawag sa'yo nung 1985 is what? Superior. But look at this 2013 norm, fast forward, the same test. The norm of this will change. The ceiling of 2013 is much higher than the ceiling of 1985. Diba? Kasi yung ceiling, yung pinakamataas ng 2013, 95 to 99 will make you a superior. That was not the way it was 1985. 1985, all you needed to get is 60 to 65 for you to be considered superior. Now, given that illustration, tignan mo mangyayari kung matigas ang ulo mo at hindi mo ina-update yung norm mo. You are using an expired norm. Let's say it's already 2013, but you are using a 1985 norm. Student 1 takes your test, he gets a score of 80. I-interpret mo ngayon yung raw score ng 80. Pero ang tigas nga ng ulo mo, ang ginagamit mong norm is 1985. So what happens? That 80, you will interpret it as superior. Pero tignan mo kung sinunod mo yung tama. Gumawa ka, nag-develop ka ng norm ng 2013. Yung 80 na yan, in 2013, low average. See? Ang laki ng diferensya niyan ha. Superior, low average, big difference. Lalagpasan mo yung mean niyan eh. 'Di ba? From below the mean or from above the mean to below the mean. Yung transition yan eh. But if you're using a 1985 norm in the year 2013 and somebody gets an 80, you call that person superior. Ipapasok mo ngayon sa kumpanya mo yan. A-assignan mo ngayon ng mataas na pwesto yan kasi ang taas ng test score niya. But look at the danger. That person, you say superior, in real life, he's really low average. Kasi nag-iba na yung standard. Masyadong mababa yung standard ng norm na ginagamit mo because it's already outdated. The same thing with participant 2. She scores 75. You use the 1985 norm, it means she is superior. But 75, the raw score of 75 in 2013 means fail. Big difference. From above the mean, way above the mean, 1985, to way below the mean, 2013. Sasabihin mo, yung subject 2, grabe to, ang galing, superior to, tanggap yan sa trabaho. But remember, you use a 1985 norm. Had you use a 2013 norm, yung 75 na yan, ibig sabihin yan, fail. So, biruin mo, kung matigas ang ulo mo, yan yung ginagamit mong norm, outdated. Mali-mali yung label na binibigay mo sa mga raw scores. Lahat sila ang tawag mo malulupit. Kaya takang-taka ka eh. Ang tatalino ng mga participants ko ngayon Hindi sila matalino. Outdated yung norm na ginagamit mo kasi. Now you're wondering why your company is falling apart. Kasi nangongolekta ka ng mga taong hindi naman talaga magagaling. At sino ang salarin? You are using an old norm. Kaya alam nyo ang application dito as we close, you always check if the norm is updated. You have a raw score. You have the norm with you. Before you use that norm to interpret your raw score, tignan mo muna yung origin ng norm. Yung detail ng norm. Nakasulat naman sa manual yan eh. Kailan ba ginawa yung norm? Within 5 years pa ba? If the answer is yes, go ahead. That is the right norm to use to interpret your raw score. But if the answer is no, nakita mo, 1932 pa yung norm. 2021 na ngayon. Don't use it. Because it will only give you an inaccurate assessment. Sir, anong gagawin? Halimbawa, meron akong raw score. Yung norm, expired na. Paano ko i-interpret? Ang sagot ko dyan, in the first place, dapat hindi mo in-administer yung test na yon nang wala ka pang updated norm. Dapat nga hindi siya nakakuha ng raw score kasi nga dapat hindi mo in-administer. Pero siguro, hindi mo pa to alam, o di, ano nang gagawin natin? Well, there are two ways to deal with that. You have a raw score, you have an old norm na hindi mo na dapat ginagamit. Response number one, you buy the new norm, the updated norm for that test. Kaya lang, ang problema doon, hindi mo naman pwedeng bilhin yung norm lang eh. Usually, package deal yan eh. Let's say you are using test A. Tatawagan mo yung kumpanya na gumawa ng test A. Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin, bili po ako ng norm lang. No, no. Kasi bawat year, may mga edition din na nangyayari sa mga items. You need to buy the entire test. What if you don't have budget? You cannot afford. O, di ba? Response number two, ang pwede mong gawin, mag-develop ka ngayon ng current norm. Di ba? Kaya nga sabi ko, kapag bumibili kayo ng test, itatago nyo yung mga raw scores na nakukuha nyo in using that test. You have 5 years to collect the scores. And then at the end of the fifth year, edi expired na yung old norm. Pwede mo ngayong gamitin yung mga scores na inipon mo within the 5 years to create the new norm. Ganon. Okay? Eh yun nga, paano kung wala? Kasi hindi mo ginawa yun. O di tawagan mo, bili ka ng bagong test. Eh kung walang pambili, humanap ka ng ibang test. Pero you cannot interpret that raw score using that old norm. Okay? That's unfair for any test takers. Principles to remember as we end this short lecture on norm. Again, number one, norm must be appropriate to the raw score. Tugma dapat match nationality, age, and sex. Number two, norm must be representative of the target test takers. And number three, norm must be updated. And all these things, you constantly apply for what purpose? Gusto kasi natin, yung label na makukuha natin from a raw score is accurate. But the chance, yung tsansa na yung label na ibibigay mo sa raw score is accurate, kailangan i-apply mo yung mga principles na diniscuss natin for today. So I hope you learned something from that short discussion. Short ba? Parang ang dami ko sinabi, no? From that discussion on basic principles to remember in using norms. If you have any questions, just comment down below and I'm going to do my best to answer that question. So sana nakatulong ito sa inyo. Thank you everyone. Until next time.